Thanks for having me, everyone. My name's Lyndsey, and I'm going to be talking to you about my Drupal journey and about my experience running a big Drupal project in Australia, a community project. And thank you for having me. It is very exciting to be in New Zealand, a place where the first thing the driver says to you when you leave the airport is about climate change, and then you get to your hotel and they have fundraisers on endangered species and really talking about the wildlife and the climate here. And then to see posters that point to issues that we have in Australia around our treatment of refugees at the moment. Fortunately, yesterday we kind of got our own back a little bit, and we are slowly catching up with New Zealand. But it's such a privilege and an honour to be here with you. So I want to talk about. I'm really going to make this a little bit personal and talk about my experience with Drupal, and particularly my experience over the past year, because my perspective of Drupal and especially getting involved in the community to this level has been very different than a lot of other people's experiences, I think. And I've been building in Drupal for 5 years, and before that I built for 5 years previously in Joomla. So I really love open source software. I really love the potential of technology to connect communities and to connect people. And the projects that I've worked on have been not-for-profit, government, community-based. That's really around training and empowering people to be able to use technology. And to not only be able to use it, but to be able to use it with confidence and to create content and to create projects. And we're really at such an exciting moment for communities and for community projects and the use of technology within communities and within society, where we have people that no longer fear technology. So people no longer fear technology. They see it as an integral part of the future. They see it as an integral part of sustainability for their employment, but also for their communities. And they've touched on technology in quite a lot of ways now. So they've used it for social media and for, they might have gone into the code and used it for CSS or, a whole range of things. Whereas a few years ago, when you would work with not-for-profits and community organisations, they wanted you to do stuff for them, and then getting them to hand over the reins and to do things was, you needed a lot of coaching and hand-holding to get them to that point. Whereas now, people realise that if they don't have exposure to technology, they need to get that. And that makes it a really exciting time for opening up ways to get more people involved. A lot of technology communities are having issues with diversity and how we engage more women, how we become more relevant. And Drupal's the same. So this is, in some ways, this is a story, and my perspective has been not just on Drupal as software, but more Drupal as a community in relation to other community challenges that are happening. And I'm from a rural community. So I've worked remotely and been able to live all over, and I currently live in rural South Australia. And my background has been a lot of stuff around rural communities. And if you want to create sustainability, and if you want to mobilise people, and if you want to tackle climate change, and if you want to get people involved in changing their economies and collaborating and sharing, then technology really holds such an important key to doing this. And so I accidentally fell into technology. I was a participant in the Rudd government, Australian politics, we really won't go there, but at one point we had a government that put together a 2020 summit. And so my background in the sorts of community work that I'd been doing, I got to go along and to be a participant. And so after the conference, I get a call from someone, and she says, would you like to work for our company? Which I did, and it was tech, and so that we were building in Joomla. And at the time I thought, I think this is just going to be a short-term thing. I'll just fill this until I find something else. But the minute I started building and the minute I started using this, I was like, this is how we do it. This is how we connect people. This is how we structure and share information information and knowledge. This is how we collaborate. This is how we do things at scale, and this is how we replicate our projects. So the entire time that I've been in technology, it's been about what is the best fit for creating the conditions for those sorts of projects. So when I finally moved over into Drupal, all of the blockers that of consistency and experience that I'd run into with Joomla kind of vanished. New challenges and new issues came, but what I really love about Drupal is, the things that we all love around the ability to be able to configure it, the ability to be able to expand it. So this was the company that I worked for. And the first project that I did was an Australian homelessness clearing website. So at the time, government was committed to halving homelessness by 2020. It was no longer going to be an issue for us, so it was incredibly exciting. So I came in as a content person and very quickly picked up the tech and the site building and the project management. And then, like government projects, they closed the site quite quickly after the contract ended. So it was my first experience in working on a government project that has hundreds and hundreds of pages of content and a community around it, but the funding dries up and there is no will to keep it going. And at the time they were moving everything to WordPress, so they kind of just pushed it into a little WordPress site. It was never quite the same, and then there's been that transition. So it's kind of been a lesson in understanding that government priorities will change, and so while there are exciting times for government, understand that government priorities can change. So now, so unfortunately at the start of last year, the company that I was working for closed. And the reasons why and the business reasons around sustaining a technology business in this climate and, the things that you need to do and evolve, that's really a talk for another day. But where we were going was around the productization of Drupal. We were doing some really great stuff with regional local governments and also not-for-profit organisations, and we were moving into that productised stream. And so the company closed at the start of last year, and at the same time I had a baby. So it was my second, so it's not quite so traumatic as the first, and we had a big gap. So I found myself out of a job with a baby, living in a small country town, under-networked, knowing no one within the Drupal community. And I really do say that quite literally. I had a few people that devs that I'd worked with over the years, but there were also projects that we had run with the company that where we hit skill shortages. So I was very aware of what the skill shortages were, where it's difficult to train people or to find people. Most of the stuff that we did was not so much needing to write code, it was using modules that existed and dealing with the interfaces there. Although the needs of not-for-profits and the needs of government are beginning to get more sophisticated, and so the opportunities to actually start writing interesting modules and doing really interesting things do exist. So I find myself under-networked in a rural country town with a baby, no job, and really no idea of what's next. And ideas about what I would like to be building, but really not the capacity to actually implement them all myself. And that's another thing about Drupal. It's there's so much to it, and that's exciting, but it does pose a risk because we can't all be all people. And I see that quite a bit when I'm engaging with people within the community, where you'll meet people and they'll just be amazing devs, or they might do back-end stuff really well, or they do the server stuff really great, but then they do the other stuff badly because you can't do all things. And so I tend to sort of, really think about how would you match people better? What are the conditions to create projects where people are working together and you're working with people's strengths? And so that's where I've been at for about the past 12 months is do I stick around in Drupal? Can I network myself up into Drupal enough? Can I start to do the projects that I really want to do? How is the Drupal 8 climate going? Is it robust enough? Do I feel confident enough to start taking things and building things and then being able to adapt to the challenges that might be thrown up? So what are those challenges? And so, the first step for me was trying to get involved in the Drupal community. And when you're doing it remotely, it's incredibly difficult. I mean, you come along to things like this and straight away you realise how lovely people are and you get to talk and you get to meet people, and that's really amazing. But the entry points into the community are actually reasonably difficult and reasonably frustrating. And it's not that once you're in, it's not welcoming and it's not nice. It's just that getting in there in the first place is difficult. And that's not a Drupal criticism, that's a community criticism. That's a lot of communities that are established, how you start to restructure communities so that you are, as people start to become experts in their field and the time that they have to spend on things starts to change because they've got competing priorities around work and business and family. How do you make the best use of their time so that they can be mentors or supporters of a next generation that comes up into the community without burning anyone out? So how do you get that information and that knowledge flow throughout communities? And if you look at any community, and I'm from a rural background, and that's something that rural communities talk about all the time, is that communities are aging out. How do you create space for new people, for younger people? Sometimes when they're talking younger people, they mean people in their 50s or their 60s, because they just haven't been able to engage with new people at any level. And then this is the same sort of stuff that's going on in a range of open source communities as well. So by no means is it Drupal specific, but I think our communities have a lot to learn from each other, and to create inclusive communities that people can step into, see opportunity, particularly if you want to increase diversity within your communities. So if getting people that can't look at a community and see themselves within that immediately to feel like they can step into the community and enter the community and will be welcome, you need to open up doors and windows that allow people the opportunity to be able to interact with that. And that's the specific project that I'll talk about shortly. So I have managed to kind of get somewhere, and I now chair the Drupal Community Spotlight Committee. So my journey into Drupal has been very much around use of Twitter. If anyone uses Twitter, I'm quite active there, and getting involved in Drupal Slacks, and just having conversations with people. And it's actually afforded me a really interesting perspective of the Drupal climate and the Drupal landscape, because people tell me stuff. And I know a lot about how things are going. I've also been playing around with the Drupal Dojo group and Open Social. So I've also seen how things are going from not just a module perspective, but also how some of the distributions are going, how some of the server stuff is going with Drupal 8. So yeah, really, it's really interesting to see that. So there's opportunity, as far as I'm concerned, for creating community projects that allow devs, techs and non-techs to come together and to start to build things. And as soon as I came into open source, I was so inspired by open source as a concept. The fact that people wanted to create software that anyone could have access to, and we could create an internet that was free and open, and you weren't weren't confined by commercial barriers to be able to participate. Knowledge was shared, people were helped. That was such an inspiring thing to come from a community background and to see an actual life-size community projects where this very thing is done. And so what I've really been thinking about is, we're at the point where we've built the tools. To me, the next logical step is we build the projects that use the tools. So we build the projects that change the world, that use the tools that we've been building to change the world. And I think that fits. I think that fits with the spirit of communities like Drupal. I'm involved in digital rights, and it fits with them as well. I was at a festival and someone was telling me that at 40, most tech people hit a midlife crisis where they realise they're not going to change the world. And I think, you're not done at 40, we could still do it. And so this talk I did for the first time in the Netherlands, actually. And what was really interesting about that is it was a hacker festival, so hackers and activists and people that are working at an international level and a local level to create a free and open internet and to work through digital rights issues. And what's still partly missing within those communities is how we connect the high-level stuff, how you connect this knowledge around digital rights and technology and people that have been building the internet, so they've been thinking about this stuff. How do you start to connect that with the public who really need to understand this? They've always needed to understand it, but now it's crunch time because technology is moving so fast. We're not keeping up with our laws around digital rights and privacy and facial recognition, and so we're not keeping up with the laws and we're not keeping up with the community dialogue around it. And so you've got this movement, you've got this speed, I guess, where it's really changing for technologists, that the community is expecting solutions and looking for solutions, and how do we fill that gap? And I believe that part of the way that we can fill that gap is through creating projects, because I think projects create momentum and they create space for people to be able to see where they can participate and what they can contribute. And so me in a small rural town in South Australia with a baby and no job, and I just made 100 followers on Twitter, was at the point of, where do I go from here? How do I connect myself into the Drupal community and into communities generally, show what it is that I'm talking about, because it's easy to talk about stuff, but people kind of want to know what it is that you're talking about. So I was really on the lookout for a project that would allow me to create these conditions. And so just before Christmas, digital rights activists on Twitter and also media outlets like Triple J were talking about how there was all these Centrelink debts that people were getting. And not only that, on the comment threads on Facebook, people were saying, hey, I've got one of those debts too. I've got one of those debts too. And hundreds of people were saying this. And so from my perspective, it was like, I think we've got a project here. And I think we've got an example of a community problem that organisations are not agile and agile and equipped enough to fill. What organisations step in and quickly pull together a campaign around this, because it's tech. So we look to the social services organisations and the legal organisations, but their use of tech and their comfort with tech just isn't there yet. And they want it to be there, and they need it to be there, and we need to help them to get there. But I really realised that even for an organisation like, say, the Australian Council of Social Services or one of the legal aid organisations to pull together and create a campaign around this, first they were going to have to think of the specs for a website and put out a proposal and meet with all their stakeholders. I was like 3 months tops. But really, I doubt anyone's going to be able to touch this. So I thought I would. And so I'll just jump to where we ended, where we're at now with this. So where we're at now is we have a website, and the website to date yesterday, has 622 stories, because we asked people to share their story with us, and that those 622 stories account for $4 million worth of debts. And the campaign itself has led to 18 million in debts being revoked in New South Wales alone. And recently we're starting to get the Senate inquiry reports on numbers, and those numbers only reflect a small snapshot, but the snapshot that we've got so far that we've confirmed is that there were 20,000 debts that were either reduced to zero or reduced, that were sent out in a few months alone. So the feeling that there was an issue is actually come to pass, that there was actually this massive issue, and the massive issue came down to the use of data matching and the use of algorithms between government agencies, and matching data from an imperfect data set. So 35 years of data across multiple systems, and then to try to match that into something that was seamless, that would create accurate information, was never really going to happen. But it sort of points to the pressures of what's happening within how people expect that technology should work, how they expect that data matching should work, how they expect that algorithms should work. And what we saw instead was that in the push to keep going ahead with this policy, and effectively to crowdsource the problems with it onto people. So rather than stopping, and rather than redoing the algorithm, or rather than saying that it's not possible, what's happened is the onus has been on people to go back and prove by getting pay slips over the past 5 to 7 years as to whether or not they actually owe this money, whether or not they did anything wrong in the first place, whether or not there's a data matching problem. So the feeling that we were seeing this huge community issue did come to pass. There was this huge community issue, and you know, the response showed this. So when you're in a small country town and you're looking for a project, you're kind of looking for clues to say, let's go, let's get started. And it's one of the things that I really love about technology, is that ability to create momentum and to get something happening. So for me, the cue was this headline: Bludgers and Imaginary Debt. What the hell is happening with the latest Centrelink clusterfuck? So if the Australian media uses the word clusterfuck, you know you've kind of got a bit of a campaign on your hands. And that's what we went with. So for me, I just hit 100 followers, and I know that I could build this site and get this momentum, but that's actually not enough to really create change. And so looking at who's in the community and community assets and what we've got to work with, it's clearly people within Twitter that had the ability to get the reach that I was never going to be able to get. And so for me, that person was Asha Wolf, and if people follow her on Twitter, then you'll know what a strong campaigner and journalist and advocate she is. And so seeing this other headline, knowing that we've got a campaign here, and then the next thing Asha tweets about Legal Aid Victoria talking about Centrelink. And this is also the start of the long weekend for New Year's Day, and I didn't have any plans that weekend, so I was pretty free. So that there was also this really nice timing opportunity where people were around, people were looking for an activity. I believe that we can mobilise people and get people involved in activities, and so we just need to create the conditions for that to happen. So and I didn't know Asha at all at this point. So I see this and I say, we should build a website. How do you connect with someone to get them interested in what you want to talk about? And fortunately, on this day, she was interested in hearing a little bit more. And so I said, I'll do it in Drupal and I'll do it in GovCMS so it can be flexible and expanded. I need 5 others interested because it's too big to do alone, and I can train. And that she knew the proper algorithm geeks. So the decision to do things in Drupal and also GovCMS was particularly strategic. The first was that, the projects that I want to build and the way that I see that people can use software and can use websites as projects, Drupal fits with that because you have that flexibility, you have that expandability. So I really wanted to use Drupal for it. And I considered using something else, and I thought that what I could do was use Drupal where I couldn't find the people to do it. Where I couldn't do it myself, I wanted to find the people that would help me do it. And GovCMS was, kind of cheeky, kind of convenient. It was accessible, so I'm huge on accessibility, so that was a plus for me. Also thought people might find it amusing. But I didn't actually have a GovCMS site on my resume either. And so when you're trying to find work and you're trying to get through recruiters who just look at your resume, and every single Drupal job that I see, even if it's a straight content person, they ask for a Drupal developer every time. And they're asking for full stack developers, and they're asking for things that not only do I not have, I have never ever needed in my 5 years of building Drupal websites. And I've built over 100 websites, or been involved in builds for over 100 websites in over 50 communities across Australia. But the conditions for me to actually get employment in Drupal, are just not even getting past the recruiter stage. So I was like, GovCMS, we all know that it's still Drupal, but recruiters don't know it's Drupal, so we'll have, if I've got a GovCMS thing on my resume, then that's going to be great. The other thing that I wanted to do was to use Drupal as a project to get non-technologists into Drupal as well. And that's incredibly important for me. So as we get jobs of the future and as we get communities of the future, people that aren't exposed to this technology to any technology, to all sorts of technologies, are just going to be left further and further behind. And it's part of, and so, you see that within a regional sense. So within our regions, the difference between cities and regions is going to be huge. It doesn't need to be, because so much can be done remotely. So much more can be delivered in rural communities if you network knowledge and information and you replicate and you scale. It's actually potentially easier than it's ever been, because you don't need the physicalness that most projects tend to work in. So there's huge opportunities there. But there's also huge gender inequality issues as well, and we see that. We know that exists within technology. We know that exists within Drupal. How do we actually get more women into technology? It's not just because it's great to have diversity. It's also great for business. It's great for new ideas. It's great for the ecosystem as a whole to start to branch out how people think about technology and to get new ideas that come into it. And there's also so from a sustainability point of view, and from an equity point of view, like, this is where the jobs are going to be. This is where this is where wealth is going to be. And as jobs potentially shrink quite dramatically, if we're not allowing people to have access to technology and to be able to use it and to know the language, then we're just pushing people back further and further behind. And so the way to do that quickly, from my point of view, is through projects, because they're tangible and people can see things and they can see what they can be involved in. And that's the great thing about tech. Like, you end up with a product, so it's not just training, or it's not just a report or a strategic plan that sits on a shelf. Like, you can actually build something. And so I was very deliberate in making sure that I had no Drupal people that were going to help me. I'd pretty much tapped out my network with a couple of other projects that I'd run, and so what I wanted was to be able to train people in how to use Drupal and how to use GovCMS. So the real thing that I needed first was someone to bite. So it was great that there was going to be this the presence from Asha continuing to talk about what she was going to continue to talk about anyway. anyway. But as far as the project went, I needed someone that was actually going to help to build this website and to start that momentum. And it happened incredibly quickly. Like, my challenge ended up becoming a challenge of managing enthusiasm. Like, how do you manage people that are coming at you from all areas that actually want to be involved in this? Because people were around, people saw it was an issue, people cared about it. They're not supposed to care about Centrelink issues, but people do care about Centrelink issues. And you're never going to know what people care about until you open up opportunities for them to start working together and talking about what they care about. So Amy was one of the first people that got involved in this, and she said, "I've got no skills to offer aside from proofreading, probably not useful, but I'd share the shit out of this." So the proofreading side, we're straight back to content. What does a website need? It needs content. We need to be able to get the content in and to manage it, to edit it, to collect the stories, to moderate the stories, to put the news articles up. And we were already getting so much news content that was being created, blogs, analysis, what was going on with the algorithms. And so Amy's become one of the key people within the campaign. And she now manages this site. She started building in Drupal. She advocates for it. I've seen her fiercely contest in Slack why someone should stick with Drupal. And she had all of the attributes to make her a fantastic Drupal CMS person, but she'd never actually been exposed to it. And now she's managed this huge site that's got over 600, 700 articles, 600 or 700 600 user stories that have been added. So her resume and her employment prospects have just changed considerably. She can work remotely, she can apply for Gov CMS jobs. So I think that's just so exciting. I'm kind of going to skip ahead because I'm getting the 10-minute wind up. We did a few things. When you're creating momentum and you need to be able to bring in non-text and text together, you need to be able to start to set up certain infrastructure to get that happening. And in the absence of that perfect infrastructure existing, it was about bootstrapping what already exists. So the first thing was to have a really clear hashtag so that we could continually talk to that and share to that, and people knew that if they used that hashtag, they would be part of the conversation and their voice would be heard and it would be shared. And so that was quite key in building our community around that. Then we used Drupal for the website, and then we used Slack. And not everyone kind of came into Slack. Lots of interactions just stayed within Twitter, or stayed within Facebook, or stayed within Google Docs. But as far as the core organising team and the conversation that kind of happens, they came into Slack. And most of those have ended up being women, and most of those have ended up being from rural areas. And the stories even from that have been really quite powerful as far as people being able to get involved in an interesting project, something political, putting together Senate reports, a whole range of stuff. And so, I'm not a designer, so we didn't even have design. So I start building this site, and then we start to get designers that start contributing stuff for us. We start to hear stories, like really powerful stories, awful stories, people that are literally choosing between rent and food. And people always tend to go for rent because you have to maintain shelter. There were people that, there was especially Reese, who his mother attributed his Centrelink debt to pushing him over the edge, because the thought of having this $10,000 debt when you've got underlying mental health issues was incredibly stressful. And we know from some of the Senate inquiry reports that those numbers, that Reese probably wasn't alone. The sharing of stories was an interesting one, because I kind of thought 20, we'd be happy if we got 20 stories, because getting people to contribute content is not always very easy at all. And so the 18th of January, so we're about 3 weeks in, and we already had 334 stories. So people really wanted to talk about this. All of this was anonymous. We had the ability for people to be able to filter by certain things. So it was anonymous, but there was data there. So again, this is where Drupal kind of came into it. By being able to split up these fields and having a certain amount of data, we could provide people that were interested with snapshots about when different debts were coming in, and we also had the numbers. So that tally of being able to show how much debt became a really interesting campaigning point for us. And so I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Nick, because he's been one of my Twitter friends that I connected with on Twitter, and so he was the one. So I could do most of the stuff, like most of the setup, but what I couldn't do was the calculation field and to get that looking good. So there was a few small elements that I needed. So I got Nick. He came in, and for him, I don't know, like it was a couple of hours of his time. It was huge for the project. It was the module that I think he finished off a module or added to a module. So there was also a Drupal module that was added too. ThoughtWorks came in, and because they were around and it was holidays, so they had a look at the server setup for me, because I had to put up my own server. So they just had a look at that to make sure that it was secure and offer advice on HTTPS stuff, because I'd spent many years staying away from anything to do with URLs, and so mostly most server stuff. And so by doing this project, we also allowed other stuff to happen externally that had nothing to do with me. They just started happening. So we had Centrelink is broken, so that was a campaign that was started. I started to get these like random, someone that was like a graphic artist and had done lots of political campaigns over the years for like big things. They were in London and they were bored, and so they just start sending me like all of these memes. So Madge Smith gets a net debt letter. Fuck Madge, £20,000. I got like, I don't even know, I probably got like 20 of these. This one's my favourite. Oh, look, Alice, it's one of them, not my debt fellows they told us about at the LMP Lodge. Don't ever go near one of them. So straight away being cast as a dangerous woman is always a fun position to be put in. And then it started to happen offline as well. So this is a small country town in Victoria, and someone there just started to create these not my debt posters. And they started putting it up in their bus shelters and in their shops. And there started to be protests and protests in different locations. These people weren't on Twitter, so they didn't hear about what we were doing through Twitter. But incredibly concerned about where this policy was going. And so what also happened at the same time was ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Services, they pulled together a group of 30 organisations, legal, social, because we had kind of created this storm of people talking about this issue. They then needed to respond and to support, which was actually a risk that I was quite aware of, especially because it was over the holidays. So we're kind of pulling people together, yet at the same time it's holidays and services are on holidays. So how do you start to responsibly manage that? Like that was a part of a consideration. But that experience of seeing those 30 organisations come together really let me see how they collaborate. And so the opportunities for different tools and for different platforms to actually make their collaboration and their working together easier. And I think that will be one of the transitions from web. We'll stop thinking about it as organisations using it to show people what it is that they do, to start to use it much more sophisticatedly to get people more involved in their actions, better ways for them to collaborate across services when they do need to campaign or they do need to respond. So for me, the part of the future is not just on the pretty and the visual and the marketing, but moving much more into the collaboration and cross-sector relationships. Again, we started to get stickers that just ended up going up in Melbourne, and real concerns around the ethics involved in the use of algorithms. So here we're going into digital rights, and we're going into how our data is being used, and we're going into not only just how the government's using it, but also how private organisations are using our information. So if it was a psychology study, the ethics would not get passed by a proposal board. Oh, that one back there I don't know how to go back, said from someone saying, I'm basically computer illiterate and I just don't know how to use these systems. And that's a huge issue for us as technologists when we start to push things more and more into a digital world. Firstly, it's about accessibility, and I think accessibility often gets poorly done, needlessly, although I will say that the commitment from Drupal 8 to accessibility is just magnificent, and it should be one of the biggest selling points that not only we're talking about with potential customers, but also we're making sure that they get maintained. They get maintained when we do things in the front end, and we keep that commitment, because I think that it is really one of the big assets that Drupal's got. But I know people that give computer literacy courses to people, and they literally have to explain what a space bar is because they just don't know. So we're comfortable with technology, but we've got a lot of people in the community that simply aren't, and so it's incredibly difficult to design services for them. And so I'll just do just a couple of slides. So, we really kept this positive. This was about communities coming together, people feeling like they could participate and support each other, and also getting real outcomes. There's a plug for Electronic Frontiers Australia. Just going to end on a Drupal note, and I've just got three more short slides. One of the other things that I think is really worth paying attention to as we look at how we bring new people into Drupal is also around emerging communities. And so how do we support emerging communities to be able to build quality Drupal products, to be able to put things together in the best way, to be able to create content for their own communities as well. And the recent spotlight story that I did was on Bikino, who's from Rwanda. And so within Rwanda, you've got this amazing population of highly educated young people, and they've got university degrees, and they really see technology as part of the future for where they want to go within their economy. And so he put out a call and had place for 50 on his Drupal Global Training Day, and got 388 people. And so, they're looking outwards, but I think they can also be looking inwards with much more focus around the types of content that they can be creating to support their own local economies. How do they maintain culture and story and conversation? And, what is it that the Drupal community can do to allow them to be able to do that better? And so someone added a comment to this story, which I thought was really interesting. And it was this guy. And he said, "I was visiting China a couple of years ago, and I met Rwanda's Minister of Youth and ICT. He knew Drupal, and he believed open source was key to reducing the high unemployment rate in Rwanda. So for me, Bikino's Drupal story is double inspiring." And I've never actually met this person, but, I sort of did in my comment, was to sort of say, if you have a minister of a country that is saying that we see your technology as not only part of the economic development of our country, but also part of the way to capture culture and story, and to really build the community internally, these are opportunities that we really should take. I don't think that there's necessarily the ecosystem within Drupal to really take advantage of those opportunities. I think that would just be amazing to start to address that and to look at what we could be doing there. And that's pretty much what Bikino said after that was, it's because he is a community person first. And so for him, if you have your minister saying, we see how we could create this as a project for the future, and this is how we see our economy going. And you have a minister that's saying that to you. If this was a business transaction, you would go ahead and you would have meetings with them. So this is about community and building communities. So it's slightly different, and it takes a different mindset. But what we really have is a global project, and a way to create global impact, and a way to continue the transformation that we've all seen Drupal do to our own lives and other people's lives. And that's my talk, so thank you for having me.